Sally is also a very important part of the history of the Public Policy Center, because her husband Norman is one of the people that started the center back in 1987 along with Dave Forkenbrock, and Sally was on the faculty in political science here at the time, and so those kinds of relationships between the Public Policy Center and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and the social sciences is something that's really important. And so this is sort of bringing back to the history of the Public Policy Center, but also to the future of the Public Policy Center. And we had originally invited Sally to be a part of the Political Discourse Symposium that we did in November, and we wanted to talk about the role of women in politics and the role that women have on political discourse. And so Sally was unable at that time. We thought it fit perfectly in this 5-session portion of the class on political discourse for her to come and talk about her new book and about women in the judiciary, which is also obviously a very important part of political discourse in a way that I think sometimes is overlooked, but it's extremely important in terms of that relationship, not just with elected officials, although obviously in many states the judiciary is elected. For those of you who do pay attention to this issue, I think it's very interesting. That Sandra Day O'Connor, one of her passions right now, is going out and talking around the country about the challenges of having elected judiciaries and the challenges of money being put into those elections and then what that does to the judicial branch. So that's one aspect of that may be touched on next week when we have Bob Edgar here from Common Cause. But I think Sally's going to bring another important piece of that discussion today in talking about women in the judiciary. So with that, welcome Sally Kenney.
It's really great to be here. I've been reliving my happy days of being in political science and women's studies a long time ago and seeing old friends and colleagues. And I just really like to thank Pete for inviting me, but also just congratulate you on what a great job you've been doing with the Public Policy Center. And as somebody who was a public policy professor for 14 years before I took this latest job, I just think what you're doing to really involve students, faculty, and the community is exactly what you should be doing. So congratulations to you and Colin and Karen and everybody who's been involved with the project. And also just really salute you for, as great as he was, David Forkenbrock was not putting gender at the center of public policy, nor was Norman. So this is a great leap forward. So thank you very much. And what I want to do tonight is tell you a little bit about this project that I've been working on for a very long time. And I hope that the book will be out sometime in the next couple of months. Gender and Justice, published by Routledge. Before I start, I'd just like to make a number of points that are common points that I make in all of my work. And one of my frustrations, of course, is that oftentimes the discipline of political science doesn't really recognize courts as political institutions sufficiently. And that's also true of the folks who study women in politics. So that in the field of women in politics, people mostly study Congress and they look at women legislators. They don't look at even those who study elected officials or are trying to get more women into politics, don't look at judicial elections and women judges and that important third branch of government. Also that I am really interested in trying to look at why it is that women judges do so well in the South, which is supposed to be a region that's inhospitable to women elected officials. So if you look at women judges, and particularly the Chief Justices, 8 of the 13 southern states have women who are Chief Justices. So this idea that women can't win in the South is perpetuated by focusing exclusively on legislative rather than judicial offices and elections. And I'm also concerned that that people think that gender equality is something that's natural or inevitable that will come as women graduate in equal numbers from law school and become a higher percentage of the legal profession. But in fact, I think there's a lot of things to be concerned about, that it's very easy to reverse the gains that we've had. And in fact, it may be completely different, going from 0 to 27%, and going from 27 to 52%. So whatever we did to get us to this point, we may need to rethink our strategies and particularly mobilize to get from 27 to 52%. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is a little bit, just tell you the overview of the book, which I hope will advance a theory of how to do a gender analysis rather than just use sex as a variable, which is the more common way social scientists and political scientists bring gender into their analysis. But I'd also like to tell you about how I think we should go about making the case for more women judges, and it should be one that does not focus on women's difference from men. So, as all of you know, the percentage of women in the legal profession has grown over time, and it looks like there's a steady incremental gain. But that increase actually conceals a lot of variation. For example, women have not steadily grown as a percentage of federal judges. And I think this chart actually shows that much more clearly. And so if you look at what happened when President Reagan came into office, at nearly half the percentage of women nominated, and similarly, when George Bush took over, the numbers plummeted. And most interestingly, when I asked the woman who was in the White House counsel's office, how does President Bush factor gender into making his judicial selections? And she said, oh, that's very important, and I know we're doing as well as our predecessor. So I sent her my spreadsheet, and I said, who have I left out? Because my numbers show a pretty strong drop. And almost nobody has been counting or sounding the alarm or saying there's something wrong, that we're going backwards rather than forwards. And so there can be times of gain, but it isn't the case that there's a steady incremental increase that's reflecting the percentage of women graduates or women in the legal profession. And you look at, we have a little over 30% of women who are state Supreme Court justices, which is really flattening out. But also more interesting is that we have a lower percentage of women state court judges outside of state Supreme Courts, which sort of belies the idea that a lot of women in politics folks use, the idea of a pyramid. We get women at the lower levels and then they work up. But that actually isn't true in a lot of state and local political offices. Women will run for the first time for the state legislature, and we have no women county commissioners. So the whole idea of the pyramid and kind of the inevitability of women trickling up, I say, needs to be rethought. So here's just an example of the 46 or so examples that I've documented of reversals, where a woman state Supreme Court justice has been replaced by a man. So you see the number going up to around 32%, but that kind of number is concealing all the examples where I think we're going backwards. And that really worries me, how easy it is. And here's just, if this helps people graphically, this is another graphical rendition of that list. But the point is just the simple one that there isn't steady or inevitable progress, but it can be reversed. And I'd just like to point out that here's how Iowa is doing, which is below the national average, right, at 21%, which ranks it somewhere around 31, and behind the great state of Louisiana in the proportion of women in state judicial positions. Okay, so that's the sort of factual sort of picture that I'm tracking and trying to educate people about. But the book is actually a different kind of project that has another goal, which is to actually be an example of how to do gender analysis. So one of the things that really worried me about the folks who study women judges in political science is pretty much the only question they can think to ask is whether women judges decide cases differently from men. They mostly decide that they don't, and then they continue to ask the question and say, we failed to uncover the true gender difference that we know is there, or women have just been brainwashed by the legal profession, or we haven't got a sophisticated enough measure, or the women are male identified, or there's some sort of apology, but no empirical evidence actually leads people to say, is that the right question? Have we answered that question, or have we put that issue to bed? So, the first chapter in the book looks at all those studies and talks about how they're sort of assuming the differences they're trying to find and how they're mostly not finding the difference, and yet they keep asking the question, and the finding of no difference never seems to count as a finding. and how maybe we should ask a different question. And I sort of review that literature. So what I argue there is that the only way to think about gender is not to run a regression analysis where sex is a variable. There's a lot of times when you want to use sex as a variable. For example, if we suspect that it's taking women twice as long to confirm when a president appoints them, or women are twice as likely to not be confirmed overall, or there's a gap between the percentage of women in the legal profession and the women judges. There's a lot of reasons to use sex as a variable, but it shouldn't exhaust what a gender analysis is. That a gender analysis is much more than using sex as a variable and treating men and women as if they're different. So, having criticized my profession and my friends and colleagues, I then set out to provide an example of how I think we should do it. And so what I did was take a different jurisdiction and ask a different gender question, where the topic is women judges, but the question is some broader political science concept. And I talk about how we can illuminate that political science concept by using a gender analysis and having as our subject matter women judges. So the first example of that is to look at state court judges, and particularly the campaign to have the first woman on the Minnesota State Supreme Court, Rosalie Wall. And when I went out and started studying Justice Wall and found her a very interesting subject, I expected it to be a straightforward issue of policy implementation. Feminists in Minnesota had decided, well, what's the point of passing domestic violence legislation if the judges who interpret that legislation believe that boys need to be with their fathers even if they're batterers, and that there's nothing wrong with beating your wife, or etc. And so I thought, when I studied why it mattered to have a woman on the state Supreme Court, people would sort of give me that sort of story. And in fact, what people told me is that this was a powerfully emotional event, that when people learned the news, they sobbed. Some people tell you it was one of the most important events in their life, sort of like the Wellstone plane crash or the killing of Kennedy, where they can remember where they were standing when they heard. And then the letters that poured in to congratulate her said things not like, at last we will have effective policy implementation, but you showed us that women can do anything. You showed us that there's life after divorce. You showed us this or that. They had this emotional, symbolic meaning to the election that had very little to do with public policy implementation. So I use that case as a way to say how important emotions are in social movement mobilization. Similarly, I looked in the next chapter at President Carter's appointment to the bench and studied how it was that Carter made good his policy and his goal of appointing more women to the federal judiciary. And the answer was with a very tenacious assistant White House counsel named Margaret McKenna, who partnered with outside groups. And so one of the things I've argued is that feminist policy analysts, or policy analysts in general, don't look enough at the inside-outside partnership between interest groups and government insiders. And so by looking at the case of Carter's women appointments, we can really understand the policy implementation process better. Then I go to the United Kingdom and say, why was it the case 25 years after the first woman was on the Supreme Court and the first woman was on the Canadian Constitutional Court, was there still no woman on the highest appellate court in the UK? And how did it come to be that an all-male bench was suddenly a political problem that needed to be solved? So I took the case, the subject matter of women judges, to try to analyze the concept of agenda setting and ask how was it that gender came to be on the political agenda such that the first woman would be appointed to the House of Lords Appellate Committee. The next jurisdiction I looked at was the European Court of Justice, and I looked at the concept of representation. Normally, in political science, we don't think of courts particularly as representative institutions. They're certainly not representative in the way of taking instructions from constituents. However, particularly in international and supranational courts, representation is absolutely essential. So nobody sort of says, oh my God, the Luxembourg judge at the European Court of Justice just happened to be the best man for the job. No, they say, this is the best guy we could find in Luxembourg. And why was it that it was not okay to have all German judges on the European Court of Justice, but it was okay to have only men judges? Why is it that geography merits representation, but somehow gender doesn't? And so by looking at courts as representative institutions and gender as something that merits representation, I think we can illuminate the political science concept of representation. Lastly, I looked at a case in California where the first woman on the court and the first woman Chief Justice, Rose Bird, was thrown off the bench in a retention election to look at the idea of backlash. And backlash really alone among the concepts I use is something that feminists have given a lot of attention to, but I use the idea of backlash very differently, and it's, I think, really important to try to understand backlash if we want to understand why that chart I showed you about women's representation in the judiciary is the case and why women are stalled at around 27%. So that's the overall frame of the book, is that basically if we look at the subject matter of women judges and we use gender as a form of analysis, we can actually understand these other concepts that we find interesting better. And so people should stop not doing that. And they'll probably carry on just as they always did after the book is out. Okay. So now let me tell you, that's the theoretical part. So I hope that the book is providing how not to do gender analysis, sex as a variable, how to do gender analysis, understand gender as a social process. The second thing I have is really a political project about trying to get from 27 to 52%. And how should we make the case for women judges? So in the last chapter of the book, I look at the exclusion of women and minority men from juries and the equal protection challenges to the peremptory challenges of women and mostly African American jurors, and say, what can we learn from this history about arguments? And one of the things that's interesting that comes from the jury cases is that there was a lot of disagreement about how we should think about women on juries. So some people thought that women were different from men. Therefore, when you judge women or men only by men, women have not been judged by a jury of their peers because women would reach different decisions. Other people said there's nothing different about women jurors, and so therefore excluding them is unfair discrimination. So because they're the same, they're equal, they're citizens, they can't be excluded just because they're women or African Americans. And so both arguments were put forward in the jury cases, but people could say, we don't need to resolve that question to come to the conclusion that women shouldn't be excluded from juries. Whichever position you take, an argument about difference or an argument about sameness. And so I'm trying to use that as a platform for saying the same thing about women judges. I happen to think they don't decide cases differently, but even if they do, we could agree we should have women on the bench. I can talk about this later in the question and answer, but I take 3 examples, one of which is from our own Ellen Lewin, about how having women who are just like men on the bench could actually be radical as well as assimilationist at the same time. And also an example from Joan Scott writing about the Parité movement in France, and also Derek Bell writing about Obama. And I can talk about that more if people are interested in that. So how should we make the case for women judges? I've already said we shouldn't make a case based on difference. And one of the examples is if we think about, go back to other citizenship rights, for example, voting. We no longer say, although of course we did at one time, you know, women don't need to vote because they vote the same way as their husbands if they're in heterosexual partnership, or they vote the same way as their fathers. We know as political scientists that many couples vote alike and many families vote alike. And so we don't say, okay, it doesn't matter whether women are excluded from the franchise because they're no different than the people they're partnering with. We say that they casting the vote is absolutely an essential right of citizenship. So we don't require that they be different in order to grant them citizenship rights. I try to use the example of geographic representativeness, and we can look at that in the U.S. context. It used to be the case that the Supreme Court had much more geographic balance. If you look at the circuit courts of appeals, now Congress has passed a statute so that every state in each circuit has to have a representative. And nobody says, oh my God, does the Iowa judge speak in a different voice from the Wisconsin judge? Right? We just say, no, of course the states that make up a circuit need representation on that circuit bench in order for the decisions to be seen as fair. Why is it the case then that they can all be men? So I argue that it's a very important symbol, and that we know from other kinds of cases, for example, the jury cases where we criticized all white juries, is that it's not just important that justice be done, which may be done if people are interchangeable, but it's important that justice be seen to be done. And when one goes up in front of a court, whether it's the European Court of Justice as a British litigant and sees no British judges, or it's an Iowan going to the Eighth Circuit seeing no Iowan judges, or it's a woman going before a court and seeing no women judges, one questions the legitimacy of that ruling, and one worries whether you're going to get a fair shake. So I think having women on the bench is necessary in order for the legitimacy of the courts. I also argue that, drawing on the work of a political theorist named Anne Phillips, who's British, who's talking mostly about women's legislative representation, that surely in 2012 we should be able to shift the burden of proof. So the burden of proof should be on somebody who thinks women shouldn't be judges, not somebody who thinks women should. And so why not shift the burden of proof and say, why shouldn't women make up half of all of our judges? As somebody who comes from a background in employment discrimination, you can see the occupation of judge as a job. And in employment discrimination, when the qualified labor pool is not reflected in an occupation, we sense that there's something fishy about the selection process. So if women make up 50% of all political science graduates, but yet not 50% of hires for assistant professors in a political science department, we might sort of say, is there something odd about the political science selection process that might unfairly be weeding out the women applicants? And then the burden on proof is to show, oh no, it's a very meritocratic and fair system. So we can use those insights in thinking about judges just like any other occupation. One of the things we've learned from both France and other systems that have meritocratic selections, exams or other ways, but also during the Carter administration, if we actually set up a meritocratic system that's fair, open, and transparent, women do oftentimes do better than men. The problem is, most often, the most important criterion for becoming a judge is who you know. So it just so happens the best man for the job for the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals happens to have been the college roommate of the congressman who appoints the judge. And so we act as if we've had this great meritocratic system when, in fact, the most important criterion for judicial selection is being well known to the appointer, whether that appointer is a congressman, is the governor, is the president, or even the nominating commission or senior people in the legal profession. So I think we can take the example of the International Criminal Court that's really helpful. So the International Criminal Court requires that a fixed quota of judges be women through a complicated voting system. But the International Criminal Court requires separately that there be a percentage of judges who have knowledge about gender-based violence. And so it doesn't assume that just because you're a woman, you're somehow knowledgeable and sympathetic about rape and war, or just because you're a man, you don't have any expertise in that area. But it says both gender equality and knowledge of gender issues is important for the bench. And so we want to select based on both criterion separately, even though there may sometimes be some overlap. And the same is true about the International Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, is that they have sort of set as a requirement not only that we need women on the bench, but we need people who are knowledgeable about gender-based violence. The European Court of Human Rights, for example, the Council of Europe has required member states, when they put forward a list of nominees, that at least one member of that list be a woman, so that the Council can consider that person for appointment. That's pretty much my argument. So I make a practical argument that these things are not going to come of themselves, as former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who put the provision into the Security Council resolution about the International Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, that there needs to be women and there needs to be people knowledgeable about gender-based violence. It isn't self-implementing. And so if people are not watching, monitoring courts, holding them accountable, counting, writing op-eds, asking each appointer, like the White House counsel person I asked, why isn't President Bush appointing women to the federal judiciary? Why is he doing it at rates that are 8% lower than his predecessor and significantly lower than women's representation in the legal profession? And so I think I would like to energize lots of people to ask our selectors these questions and to count and to monitor them for outcomes. But what I hope will be the theoretical contribution of the work is to sort of say, let's run sex as a variable and let's analyze that, but let's do more than that. Let's start to understand gender as a social process in a more sophisticated way, as our women's studies colleagues are already doing. So thank you very much.